Zealanders moving to Australia. We want to work through these issues with all the implications that are there for full participation in our respective societies. One of the issues that we'll look at as well, unilaterally in Australia, is in New Zealand, if you're an Australian who's been resident for a year, you have voting rights. And in New Zealand, you're able to participate fully in those processes. So as part of the normal review process that occurs after a federal election in Australia, we'll be asking the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters to consider whether there's a way to return to systems that have existed in the past of giving New Zealand people who are here in Australia, contributing to society, paying taxes, working, voting rights here in Australia as well. We won't preempt those processes, but it is, I think, a really common sense position to at least examine over coming months. We look forward to working together next week at the Pacific Island Forum as well. We need to engage with our Pacific Island family, which we are both a part, and engage on issues of climate change, engage on issues of security, including maritime security. We have stepped up our increase in aid that we will provide as part of the election commitments that we've made. We made a comprehensive plan for the Pacific, and it is obviously a stronger plan if we look at ways in which Australia and New Zealand can work together. And next week I look forward to working cooperatively, not just with Jacinda, but with the sovereign nations of the Pacific when we meet together in Fiji.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Albanese. Kia koutou katoa mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you for the chance to come together and conduct a bit of a debrief on what was a really positive bilateral engagement between New Zealand, Australia and some of our respective cabinet ministers. It was particularly auspicious for us to be here during NAIDOC week, and I do want to acknowledge the First Nations people of Australia and the fact that the Indigenous relationship between our First Nations people has been a core part of not only our trade mission that we've undertaken here in Australia, which has been very successful, but also the ANZRLF, which has been happening over the past 2 days. And it was a feature of our bilateral discussions today. It's fair to say there's a lot that we can do together to further economic development amongst our First Nations people, as well as the exchange of ideas around furthering relationships there too. It has been a very successful few days for us here in Australia. Across Melbourne and Sydney, as part of our trade mission, it's really highlighted to me the depth of our economic relationship, but the depth of our relationship generally. And Prime Minister, I felt that very much reflected in the themes that we discussed and the common ground and the shared values that we had. In the last meeting, we described it as an opportunity for a reset in the relationship. And it felt to me today that we've established a work program now that brings to life that reset, and I want to thank you for that. First of all, you have now the commitment from both sides that we will have formal annual bilateral engagement between our Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Defence, Finance and Climate Change. And I don't underestimate the value and importance and signal of the fact that we have brought the climate portfolio into those annual bilateral exchanges, because it's so obvious to us that there are ways that we can work together, not only between New Zealand and Australia, but together in the work that we want to do within our own region of the Pacific to play our part in stepping up our role. Australia is already the source of significant direct investment into New Zealand around everything from waste management to hydrogen, to wind and renewable energy generation. And here, I think that there's a role for us to play in exchanging ideas as we look for innovative solutions to the climate challenges. We also discussed, as the Prime Minister has already acknowledged, the place in Australia of New Zealanders. we've long argued that New Zealanders are Australia's best migrants. And I don't say that lightly. It's borne out by the facts and what they contribute as taxpayers, which is a step above what you'll see in the tax contribution from others. And our ask has been for there to be a greater acknowledgement of the role that New Zealanders play here in Australia. The fact that we have, and you'll see this in our communique, agreement that no New Zealander or Australian should be rendered permanently temporary, that is a step change in the way that we've previously seen New Zealanders treated here. If you look at the census, New Zealanders tend to translate into citizenship at a rate of about 30%. For other nationalities in Australia, it's closer to 60%. So that demonstrates some of the barriers that exist, and we've had a commitment to work through those issues together, and we've set ourselves the ambitious timeline of having those proposals in time for Anzac Day 2023. So I think that demonstrates the commitment we have to that piece of work. We also talked at some length about the Prime Minister's recent visit to Ukraine. That was something I was very eager to hear from him. I was unable to visit, but before Prime Minister Albanese visited Kiev, we did discuss how beneficial it would be to us in New Zealand if we were able to lean in on the experience and feedback that he had from that direct dialogue with President Zelensky. And we've been talking about how we might be able to work together in the region in the future, particularly around rebuild and reconstruction. So thank you, Prime Minister, for your generosity in sharing those outcomes. Obviously, we go into the Pacific Island Forum with a full commitment to the Pacific as our region, eager to hear from our neighbours around how they see the geostrategic issues facing our region presently, what role we can play on the number one issue for our region, which is climate change, and equally, how we can further strengthen the architecture around the Pacific Island Forum as a place that we bring issues like, for instance, security-related matters. I look forward to the chance to continue that exchange and meet with our counterparts shortly. But otherwise, thank you again, Prime Minister. A very fruitful discussion all accounts.
In the past, it's tended to be one of the reasons that we haven't had a lot of New Zealanders become Australian citizens is that they haven't wanted to relinquish New Zealand citizenship. And I may be wrong, but I think it's correct to say that Australia doesn't allow dual citizenship. Is that not the case?
It's not right at all. You just can't be a member of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Those issues have. No, there are many dual citizens in this great multicultural nation of ours.
Prime Minister Albanese, previous Kiwi Prime Ministers have campaigned and lobbied for a softening of the 501 policy specifically. So where is the action on that one?
The action is one of friends. And Prime Minister Albanese has certainly not been backward in raising these issues, I can assure you from our very first meeting. 501s will continue to exist. We will continue to deport people when appropriate, but we will have some common sense apply here. And where you have a circumstance where someone has lived their entire life effectively in Australia with no connection common sense way.
On the Pacific, this is exactly what we have asked of Australia. We acknowledge that Australia will continue to deport as New Zealand currently does have provision and does deport those who don't have long-term connection to New Zealand. What we've been seeking is common sense and the spirit of friendship. And that's what Prime Minister Albanese has spoken to today.
On the Pacific Islands, Forum, a question for you both. Is the Solomon's Beijing Security Pact on the formal agenda? And how can PIF safeguard against security cooperation agreements destabilising regional security?
Well, first of all, I would reflect back on the fact that within the Rikitawa and Bow Declaration, you already have agreement amongst Pacific Island members that within the PIF is the place for discussion around security agreements that affect the region. So now it's for PIF to bring that to effect. Whilst it's obviously for the chair to determine the agenda, I do expect that this will be one of the issues that's raised, but it needs to be raised not just with any one Pacific Island Forum member in mind. Let's think about how going forward, as these issues continue to be raised and continue to be an issue within our region, that we perhaps have a bit more of a structure and architecture around how, as members, when we meet relatively infrequently, how do we make sure that we are sharing with one another, discussing with these issues with one another, but still maintaining our individual sovereignty?
Yeah, there's no doubt that security and security agreements will be a topic at the Bureau. It is one of the reasons why I'm determined to attend. It's in Australia's national interest for me to do so. I'll also be putting very much Australia's national interest and our concerns about some of the developments that have occurred in the region. We know we are living in an era of strategic competition in the region. Australia's friendship and relations with the sovereign nations of the Pacific are ones of a friend that has historically played a role in the region of being a security partner of choice. We wish to remain a security partner of choice. In the discussions that I've had, including with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, he's indicated very positively his relationship with Australia. It's something that I look forward to discussing with all of the leaders at the Pacific Island Forum next week.
The Pacific nations want more ambitious action on climate change. Would either the Australian or the New Zealand government consider going beyond the emissions cuts you've already pledged? And further to that, will either nation look to increase their foreign aid spending with a focus on climate change in the Pacific?
Well, perhaps if I can say, I've had the opportunity to speak to Pacific Island leaders, mainly on the phone, but also I've met with the the Labor government that I lead is now a part of the action when it comes to climate change. And they have all expressed that support for the change position that Australia has. Whether it's in the Pacific or when I've been in Europe or meeting with President Biden and the Major Economies Forum, it has been noticed around the world, not the least of which is in our region, that Australia is now a participant in the constructive action that's required globally to deal with the challenge of climate change. For us also, it's about the opportunity. And part of that is about investment in infrastructure. We have a $200 million fund for infrastructure investment in climate change. That's on top of the $525 million of additional support for development assistance in the Pacific. Some of that will also have implications of acting on climate change, because part of development assistance is assisting our Pacific Island friends to transition, to have access to energy which is clean, which is sustainable for them as well. So I believe that our change position will be very much welcome in the Pacific. We have a clear commitment that we have a mandate of a floor of 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. That's something that will see domestically a massive increase in the percentage of energy produced by renewables, and it is a position as well that enables us to engage on climate change in the region, not the least of which is, and something we discussed this morning, is Australia's bid to host a future conference of the parties on climate change. That's something that we've said we will host in partnership with the Pacific, as a joint bid, and I'll be having those discussions in Fiji. We intend to go ahead with the bid and how we participate and bring in Pacific Island states in order to ensure that they can be engaged and involved is something that I believe will be welcome.
And look, here, I would just highlight again the commitments that New Zealand has already made. We too have increased our ambition with our nationally determined contribution increasing to 50%. We of course already have our zero carbon legislation and goals. We've recently released our emissions reduction plan, which comes with over $2 billion worth of funding committed at this stage to implement that plan. We have our goal to be 100% renewable in our electricity generation by 2030, to price agricultural emissions the first in the world by 2025, and have a carbon neutral public service. And when it comes to our commitments into the Pacific, we've increased climate financing to $1.3 billion and committed at least 50% of that into the region. And I think now it's not just about the pledge, it's now about making it happen. It's now about seeing that through into projects that are supporting our neighbours for predominantly, of course, mitigation, but where they seek it, adaptation. And so now my sense is that it's very much about building our ability to deliver on those programs, because of course COVID has been prohibitive in our ability to further develop the business cases for the projects that already exist, develop up additional projects to help us get some of that climate financing out the door. So it's now about the delivery. We've obviously had a bit of a head start having been in government for a few years, but we want to continue to up our game in the region, and I think that's what the Pacific are looking for.
Prime Minister Albanese, you previously said it's wrong. You previously
Oh, sorry, we'll alternate.
New
Kiwi,
Zealand,
Aussie.
New Zealand and Australia are sharing a lot of common issues right now, the cost of living and also some major skill shortages as well. Mr Albanese, you campaigned on boosting nurse numbers, particularly from overseas, enticing them here. Do you want nurses to move from New Zealand to Australia?
Oh no, that's a hard no. It's a hard no.
Our priority is to make sure that we deliver on our commitments. We're not targeting our friends in New Zealand. The truth is, though, that we have labour exchanges all the time. And what we talked about, not just today, but last night as well with the business community, is how we work with our common interests. We have common challenges of skill shortages. That's part of global challenges as well. And what we want to do is work together so that we're achieving outcomes that benefit both New Zealand and Australia rather than competing against each other. That's one of the reasons why we engaged here today so constructively.
Yeah, a great example is that we have significant large-scale infrastructure projects often on both sides of the Tasman. Often there are skill sets here that are very unique, very specific, and it's not unusual for those skill sets to be shared ad hocly between countries. How can we perhaps be a bit more coordinated in some of that work? So there are tangible examples, but I think New Zealand and Australia are not unlike the rest of the world. There are some areas globally, be it mental health or just health practitioners generally, where you see a number of countries now seeking additional skills. Australia and New Zealand is amongst them, and of course it's in our interest to just continue to grow that pool.
Prime Minister Albanese, you previously said that it's wrong to position the Pacific as picking sides, but clearly China's interests don't align with Australia and New Zealand. Is this a sign that New Zealand is softening its stance on China? And for Mr Albanese, do you agree with Prime Minister Ardern that the Pacific shouldn't pick sides?
Well, so the short answer to your question is no. If you look at the context of the statement I was making, it was an acknowledgement that within our region, we've had the presence of the UK, France, more broadly the EU, China, Japan, New Zealand and Australia for a number of years. The presence of multiple donors, grant funders and interests in our region is not something that arrived in the last 12 months. That's not to say the approach of each of those donors hasn't changed over time. It's true that we have seen a more assertive position from China in our region. But whilst our position is that we therefore, on that basis, shouldn't suddenly say to sovereign nations that they have to pick for whom their relationships are with, we are also very clear on our values and the way that we conduct those relationships. It should be the Pacific priorities first and foremost. They should be free of coercion. There should be high quality investment in infrastructure because that is what our region deserves. And finally, New Zealand is very clearly opposed to the militarisation of our region. We are very clear on this. And whilst that is our considered and strong position, for the region as a whole, we also have a position that for security issues, we should be coming together to discuss those rather than having situations where we don't have a forum for which we can put those strong views and values.
Yeah, look, I think Australia's position is very clear. That we are going through a period of strategic competition in the region that perhaps wasn't there a decade or more ago. That under Xi, China has changed its position. It is more forward-leaning, it is more aggressive. Australia's position is that we will continue to engage and we want to cooperate with China where we can, but we will stand up for Australian values when we must. And I think that's a perfectly consistent position. One of the things that we're seeing is that democracies like Australia and New Zealand, when we engage in the region, there aren't strings attached. We engage because that is the right thing to do by lifting up the development of our neighbours. We have a responsibility to do that, and the more that we can cooperate on that, the greater the benefit will be. In Australia and New Zealand's case, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. When we work together, it equals 2+. And what I want to see with the reset of the relationship is us working together in as many ways as possible, because we have such common interests and common values, and indeed common populations quite often as well. There's such a seamless move between our two nations, and that's why this relationship is so important.
With respect to the...
I think we've got one last.
We've got an order.
We've got one more from the Australian contingent, I
One
believe.
more. But you know what? I think we should be generous to Patrick on the basis of
That's
the obvious
right.
question. I think we
With
can.
respect to a bonus
Well, no,
question
I
to
think
New Zealand.
we'll call it a replacement question. Can we finish with you and just come back to our Australian counterpart? Who was the final question from Australia?
So it's Brad Norrington from
Brad.
the Australian newspaper. Look, this is a question for both leaders. Overnight, the directors of MI5 and the FBI have given joint addresses in London. As you may be aware, they've warned of a growing threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party government to the UK and US interests, and by extension Australia and New Zealand as allies, espionage in private organisations, cyber attacks, commercial theft on a grand scale. What's your response to that, and do you agree with that assessment?
My response is very brief. I was asked a similar question over what I believe may have been a meeting that may have been yesterday. At least I was asked the question yesterday. Look, obviously, this is a meeting between those two parties, but when it comes to New Zealand's national security priorities, we're very transparent about them. They're listed on our website under the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, include foreign interference, cyber security issues, a number of other areas in which have been touched upon today, but that is not a departure from the national security priorities that New Zealand already has and is very open and transparent about them.
Cybersecurity and foreign interference is a massive issue, and it's something that's impacting governments, it's something that's impacting the private sector as well. And we need to work with our security agencies, as we do, in defending Australia's national interest. The first part of that is identifying where issues arise, and we've done that. I think that's been done in a bipartisan way. If you look at the increased funding for the Australian Signals Directorate, for example, and the work that they do, that's absolutely critical. We live in a more insecure world. That is why we will need to, over a period of time, increase our defence spending. When we talk about defence spending, sometimes that's military hardware, but increasingly it is in other areas of attack that Australia, both the public sector and government, but also private sector organisations, are subject to. When I've had meetings as well with private sector businesses in Australia, that's been a common theme. Ransomware attacks, for example, are becoming more common in this country as well, and it's a massive cost. It's something that from Australian citizens right through to our national government we're very conscious of.
And Prime Minister, if I may, this is where we have to look beyond geographic boundaries. I mean, even the war between Russia and Ukraine, their invasion was coupled with very much a cyber-based warfare at the same time. This was not just a traditional conflict by air, by sea and by turf. It has been coordinated with a very deliberate cyber-based attacks as well, and a very concerted disinformation campaign. And so I think increasingly, despite our geographic positioning in the world, and this is where Prime Minister Albanese's visit into Kiev is relevant to us, because we can see these issues and behaviours transcend national boundaries. We need to learn from them. We need to make sure that we're incorporating them into our national security work.
With respect to CER, I just wondered whether at this stage, with the 40th anniversary next year, you yet have a clear sense of where the most significant opportunities are, and if you do, where might they be? We did
have a discussion around the fact that coming into the 40th anniversary, it would be timely for us to reflect on whether or not there are options to continue to show that we are adapting and modernising our arrangements. Here are two clear examples, and again, we're just going to give ourselves a bit of time to work through some options as we come into the 40th. But I think that there are options in the digital and sustainability space. So those are two areas that I'd like to do some exploration. We've got good examples of existing economic instruments that New Zealand is using elsewhere. Let's just give it a little bit of examination as to whether or not that's an area where we could be reduce a bit of friction in the relationship to truly give modern life to the theme of a single economic market.
Exactly right. I mean, one of the things that I've said that the new government in Australia will be focusing on is productivity. And we'll be convening a Jobs and Skills Summit here in Australia with Australian-based businesses as well as unions. But one of the things that came through to me last night with the ANZLF as well as this morning is that when we talk about our respective national interests, there's so much common interest between us. The truth is that most businesses which operate on one side of the ditch operate on the other side as well. And how we get that economic benefit for growth and jobs for each other is something that we do have the opportunity to really focus on with the 40th anniversary of the CER. We spoke today about how important next year's gathering will be. It's in New Zealand being hosted there. And it will be, Jacinda's promised, a much better time than we've received here. There'll be whole celebrations, and the full bit. But it will be important because I think that together we're stronger. And the economic basis of the relationship when it comes to climate change, for example, we talked very specifically today, for example, about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are going to be purchased by the New Zealand government, by the Australian government and by the respective state governments. The state we're in here now, New South Wales, to give credit where credit's due, the Perrottet government have a very forward-leaning position in terms of government procurement and using that to drive the take-up of electric vehicles through the system. Now, if we're all competing against each other for procurement at the same time, we'll end up paying more for it than if there's cooperation between Australia and New Zealand. What's more, if we're looking at the potential that I certainly see Australia having of stepping up industry policy and manufacturing in the renewable sector, then that, if it's combined across our two nations, could have a much more positive economic outcome as well. So I really look forward to next year. I look forward to cooperating next week and to regular engagement with the Prime Minister, but also I know that my ministers are in contact with Prime Minister of New Zealand's ministers as well on a regular basis. So Jim and Grant, for example, will continue to chat with each other on the phone. We're almost in the same time zones. It's much more easy for us to cooperate than it is across the other side of the world. And today's meeting was an important step in resetting the relationship and was very positive, and I look forward to it being even more positive into the future. Thanks
Prime
very much.
Minister, Prime Minister, do you know how many more voters we could have in Australia if this could...